Good evening and welcome to the God Debate. My name is Malcolm Taylor, and together with Joseph Stanfield, Arnav Dutt, Mike Ray, and the Dean's Fellows, we've organized the debate we're about to see. Now, whether you are here tonight to hear an exchange of views, an enlightening discussion, or just a good show, I know you're not here to hear a long speech from undergraduate colleagues. First, allow me to recognize those in the Notre Dame community who made this debate possible. The God Debate 2 was sponsored by the Institute for Scholarship and Liberal Arts and was lectures with additional generous by History Department, Program of Liberal Studies, and Chemistry, the Center for Civil and Human Rights, ILS, and the Department of German and Russian. The Center for Philosophy of Religion, the Center for Undergraduate Scholarly Engagement, the Rooney Center for American Democracy, the Glynn Family Honors Program, and Learning Beyond the Classroom. Finally, I would just like to read a quick passage that beautifully sums up the reason why we are here tonight. Kenneth Burke writes this in the Philosophy of Literary Form. Imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you. They are engaged in a heated discussion, a discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that have gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument, and then you put in your order. Someone answers, you answer him. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns himself against you, to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending on the quality of your ally's assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The hour grows late, and you must depart. And you do depart, with the discussion still vigorously in progress. So now, please join me in welcoming two more to our discussion. Sam Harris and William Lane Craig. And please welcome our moderator, Professor Mike Ray, from the Center for Philosophy.
Thanks, Malcolm. Welcome to the second installment of the God Debate. My name is Michael Ray. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame and the director of the Center for Philosophy of Religion, one of the sponsors of tonight's event. The Center for Philosophy of Religion was founded in the late 1970s with the aim of promoting cutting-edge research on topics in the philosophy of religion and in distinctively Christian philosophy. One of our goals in sponsoring the God Debate series is to try to bring some of the very issues discussed among our research fellows to a wider non-academic audience and in a format that will hopefully be fun and engaging. Our show tonight, as you already know, is a debate between William Lane Craig and Sam Harris, coming together for the very first time to discuss the question, are the foundations of moral values natural or supernatural? William Lane Craig is research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada, California. He is best known among philosophers for his extensive and influential work in the philosophy of time and the philosophy of religion. He is known to the wider public as someone who is able to articulate and defend the doctrines of the Christian faith in a way that is highly accessible, but also philosophically and theologically rigorous. He became a Christian at the age of 16, pursued undergraduate studies at Wheaton College, and holds 2 earned doctorates, one in philosophy from the University of Birmingham and one in theology from the University of Munich. He has authored or edited over 30 books, as well as over 100 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology. Known as one of the 4 horsemen of the New Atheist movement, Sam Harris is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Moral Landscape, The End of Faith, and Letter to a Christian Nation. The End of Faith won the 2005 PEN Award for Nonfiction. Mr. Harris's writing has been published in over 15 languages. He and his work have been discussed in Newsweek, Time, the New York Times, Scientific American, Nature, Rolling Stone, and many other journals. His writing has appeared in Newsweek, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Economist, the Times London, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the Annals of Neurology, and elsewhere. Mr. Harris is a co-founder and CEO of Project Reason, a nonprofit foundation devoted to spreading scientific knowledge and secular values in society. He received a degree in philosophy from Stanford University and a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. The structure of tonight's debate will be as follows. Each debater will take 20 minutes for his opening speech, followed by rebuttals of 12 minutes and 8 minutes respectively, and then closing speeches of 5 minutes each. At the conclusion of the debate, we will have about 30 minutes for questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, line up behind one of the 2 microphones in front or in the balcony. We're letting Notre Dame students ask the first 4 questions tonight, so if you are not a Notre Dame student and somehow find yourself at the front of the Q&A line, please allow a student to go ahead of you. Time will be kept strictly. There is a timekeeper in the front who can be seen by both speakers, and once each speaker's time has elapsed, he will be given at most 15 seconds to finish his final sentence before being rudely interrupted by me, the time enforcer. Because we are keeping the time strict, we ask you to hold all applause and other indications of agreement or disagreement, cheering, crowd surfing, and the like, until the very end of the debate. Please remember that flash photography, videotaping, and active cell phones are all prohibited. Finally, remember that Notre Dame is the world's #1 institution in the philosophy of religion and also has one of the world's best theology departments. Any questions you don't get to ask during the 25 or 30-minute Q&A, you can ask of your local faculty in the days and weeks to come. And now on with the show.
Well, good evening. It's wonderful to be here at the University of Notre Dame, and I want to begin by
Bill.
thanking. Sorry.
I need to, we're going to begin each speech with me checking with the timekeeper to make sure that he's ready. And then the timekeeper is going to hit go, and then you get to go.
All right.
So you
Sorry.
go when I say begin.
Sorry for jumping the gun.
Professor Craig gets the first word in the debate. Dr. Harris gets the last word. Timekeeper, are you ready? This is 20 minutes. Begin.
I want to begin by thanking the Center for Philosophy of Religion for the invitation to participate in tonight's debate. The question of the correct foundation of morality is one that is not only of tremendous academic interest, but also one that has enormous practical application for our lives. Now, to begin with an important point of agreement, Dr. Harris and I agree that there are objective moral values and duties. To say that moral values and duties are objective is to say that they are valid and binding, independent of human opinion. For example, to say that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil, even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil, even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them, so that everybody thought the Holocaust was good. One of the great merits of Dr. Harris's recent book, The Moral Landscape, is his bold affirmation of the objectivity of moral values and duties. He inveighs against what he calls the overeducated, atheistic, moral nihilists and relativists who refuse to condemn as objectively wrong terrible atrocities like the genital mutilation of little girls. He rightly declares, if only one person in the world held down a terrified, struggling, screaming little girl, cut off her genitals with a septic blade and sewed her back up, the only question would be how severely that person should be punished. What is not in question is that such a person has done something horribly, objectively wrong. The question before us this evening, then, is what is the best foundation for the existence of objective moral values and duties? What grounds them? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend 2 basic contentions. First, if God exists, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. And second, if God does not exist, then we do not have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Now notice that these are conditional claims. I shall not be arguing tonight that God exists. Maybe Dr. Harris is right, that atheism is true. That wouldn't affect the truth of my two contentions. All that would follow is that objective moral values and duties would then, contrary to Dr. Harris, not exist. So let's look at that first contention together. If God exists, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being, and therefore the highest good. Indeed, he is not merely perfectly good, he is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature provides the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist, wholly independent of human beings. Second, theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral duties. On a theistic view, objective moral duties are constituted by God's commands. God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, reflect his essential character. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the whole moral duty of man can be summed up in the two great commandments. First, you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, and with all your soul, and with all your heart, and with all your mind. And second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression. In summary, then, theism has the resources for a sound foundation for morality. It grounds both objective moral values
Good evening and welcome to Biola University. My name is Craig Hazen. I'm the director of the Master of Arts program in Christian Apologetics here, and I'm honored to be the host tonight to get things started. Although the gym is packed with nearly 3,000 people, and it looks like you're stuffed in here pretty well, and my condolences to those of you who've already been sitting an hour and have another couple hours to go. Hang in there, hang in there. But you're not the only ones watching. There are thousands of people in other venues on this campus. Not only that, there are people in overflow sites really across the country and around the world. We have people in 30 states and 4 different countries watching this. And a special greeting to all of you who are watching across campus and in places such as Stockholm and Sri Lanka. I hope you really enjoy this. A special greeting to some distinguished guests tonight. William Lane Craig's wife, Jan, is here. Jan, it's good to see you. Betsy Hewitt is here. Yeah. My wife Karen Hazen is here. Dr. Barry Corey, the university president, is here. Yeah, we've got distinguished philosophers all over the place. Doug Divet, J.P. Morton, I hope. Is what. All right. We're thrilled all of you could come. Well, this event was initiated by the Associated Students of Biola University, and it makes sense that AS President Eric Weaver should give a quick welcome on behalf of the student body. Eric, come on up.
Good evening, everyone. Biola is a 100-year-old Christian university which desires to wrestle with big questions in an honest and open way. In my senior year, my AS colleague Mark Heath and I thought we should sponsor a blockbuster event that pursues the biggest question of all. Is it reasonable to believe that God exists? A proposal was presented to the Senate, and the student body heartily agreed. So we invited two acclaimed academic leaders in this area, William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens. And along with the wonderful people from the apologetics program, we are thrilled to see it on display tonight. On behalf of the students at Biola, I hope you really enjoy this event. Thank you.
Thank you for representing the students, Eric. You're a senior. How's that job search going in this economy? Is that going well? Yeah. We'll give you some help. Oh no, our career service is on Biola first rank. Okay. Thank you. Well, the students got this going, but there is one other important sponsor, and that is the program that I direct, the Master of Arts program in Christian Apologetics. If you like wrestling with the big questions, the existence of God, evidence for the resurrection, the problem of evil, the historical reliability of the Bible, reconciling science and faith, this really is a degree program for you. And if you're watching at a distance, you're thinking, I can't do it because I don't live in Southern California, that's not the case. We have this amazing distance learning program, and it's really open to anybody, and you don't need to relocate to Southern California, although it was a very nice day today. You might want to consider it. Although they've just taxed us into oblivion, so you may want to reconsider that. If you want to find out about these programs, check out biola.edu, BIOLA.edu, and go to the Christian Apologetics page on that site. Well, how is this all going to work tonight? It's pretty straightforward. In fact, your handy-dandy program will tell you what's going on right up at the top inside panel, the program, numbers 1 through 8. It'll guide you through what's taking place every step of the way during the debate. So take a look at that. Toward the end, we will have some time for questions, but as you notice, there's no mic sitting up in the aisles. We are going to throw it open to the students. We have a student section up there. Bravo. Students of all stripes. Now, it's your job tonight to think up some tough questions, and I expect you to actually vet them. That is, you may have learned in school that there's no such thing as a dumb question. That is not true, okay? Not to intimidate you, but check it out. Do peer review. If you come up with a question, run it by the person next to you or on either side, and let's see how it goes. So we'll throw it open for some Q&A time, and our thoughtful moderator will make sure it goes well. All right. Well, when we're done tonight, there's one other thing you need to be considering, and that is getting outside of this building to the pavilion right outside here, and several places along the walkway to pick up the featured books tonight. One is God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and another one is Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. These are the featured books. Pick them up, and you can actually have them signed. To have them signed, just walk out this building, look for all the lights, and there's some tables out there, and our distinguished debaters will be out there signing books and answering your toughest questions right there at the table, I'm sure. If you've got a lot of books at home, in fact, you own a book, so you don't need another one, perhaps you can buy some DVDs or CDs of some dynamite debates and lectures that Bill Craig has done around the world. These are first-rank materials, and our apologetics program is actually the center point for getting all of these. So if you want to get them tonight, they've got wonderful special deals. check out the red flyer in your brochure, and that will tell you the scoop. You can even pre-order tonight's debate. If you'd like to get a copy of it, it's something you want to share with a lot of people, you can pre-order it tonight, fill out the form, take it to the table, and they'll move you right through. Well, we're delighted to have Mr. Hitchens here on campus, but we realize that we theists certainly have the home court advantage. I mean, being in a basketball court, that makes a lot of sense. After all, it's a Christian university, and it even says, all glory to God or something above the bleachers there. So clearly this is a home court advantage for the theists. And I imagine the crowd here is over 2/3 evangelical Christian, although I'm thrilled to see the atheist and agnostic community turn out wearing t-shirts. I love that. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I was lecturing at the University of South Florida a few weeks ago, and the entire atheist club came out wearing t-shirts, and we had the best time ever, so I expect the same tonight. Well, since we have the home court advantage, those of you who are theists, believers in God, please let's be polite to Christopher Hitchens. He's known to say a provocative thing or two. So if you could practice your polite golf clap. All right, let's practice that. Practice that. No shouting, no hooting. There'll be plenty of opportunity for it, but let's restrain ourselves. And those of you who are from the atheist and agnostic community, again, no shouting, no hooting, no hollering. In fact, Mr. Hitchens, I can guarantee, doesn't really need a lot of help. I just saw a video of him debating like 4 prominent evangelical theists in Dallas, and it really wasn't fair. We needed more theists on the panel. So I think he will do just fine, but we're grateful for him to come to sort of the pit of opposition at Biola University, but we're grateful to really open up the doors and run through these big, important questions. And if the debate is not resolved at the end, this is a basketball court, for goodness sakes, we'll lower the hoops, we'll turn up the lights, and we'll let them go one-on-one. Yeah, I hear Chris has game, so we'll see how that goes. Well, let's get to it. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator of the debate tonight, and he'll get this party started. Hugh Hewitt. Yes, Hugh Hewitt. Hugh is a law professor and broadcast journalist whose nationally syndicated radio show is heard in more than 120 cities across the United States every weekday by more than 2 million listeners. By the way, locally, this program is heard on KRLA, which is 870 AM. I think it goes from like 3 to 6. Great program. In fact, I think it's one of the most important, smartest, fast-paced news and issues program on the airwaves today. So check that out. If you live in outlying regions, check hughhewitt.com to find out where he's broadcasting or podcasting. Professor Hewitt is a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Michigan Law School. He has been teaching constitutional law at Chapman University Law School since it opened in 1995. He was a frequent guest on all the big cable news networks and has written for the most important newspapers in the country. He's received 3 Emmys for his groundbreaking television work and is the author of 8 books, including 2 bestsellers. Professor Hewitt served for nearly 6 years in the Reagan administration in a variety of posts, including assistant counsel in the White House and special assistant to 2 attorneys general. Don't miss his daily blog at hughhewitt.com. He's always been so very generous with his time toward events like these at Biola, and we are deeply grateful for his help here tonight. Join me in welcoming our moderator, Professor Hugh Hewitt.
Number 1, please turn off your cell phones. I repeat, please turn off your cell phones. Number 2, gentlemen, to the extent that any of you have jackets that are still on, please, as Ronald Reagan once used to say, feel free to just throw them on the floor. It is a little bit warm in here. Our guests, by virtue of this crowd, it is obvious, need no introduction. I am not going to waste time then on elaborate introductions. I just wish to thank them both for being willing to participate in this most important of conversations. It is the best of times, it is the best of times for those who like to argue about God in the public square. largely because of the rise of new atheists such as Mr. Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, my friend William Lobdell, and others who have once again put to the center of the public stage the question of whether or not God does exist and whether or not Jesus Christ is his son. And it is up to people like William Lane Craig, prolific author, much beloved professor here, to enter into that conversation in a way that is both persuasive and winsome. And so without further ado, allow me to welcome up Vanity Fair columnist, prolific author, my friend and champion of freedom, Christopher Hitchens. And from this extraordinary lighthouse institution, another prolific author and apologist, a scholar extraordinaire, who, like Mr. Hitchens, has his PhD from a wonderful English university, Professor William Lane Craig. Please, Professor. It's a very structured debate according to classical lines until the questions at the end. We begin with an opening argument, 20 minutes to Professor Craig. Professor? Ooh.
Good evening. I am very excited to be participating in this debate tonight. Jan and I used to sit in those very bleachers right over there watching our son John run up and down this court as a forward on the Biola Eagles. And so I feel like I'm playing on the home court tonight. And I want to commend Mr. Hitchens for his willingness to come into this den of lambs and to defend his views tonight. On the other hand, if I know Biola students, I suspect that a good many of you, when you came in tonight, said to yourself, I'm going to check my own views at the door, and I'm going to assess the arguments as objectively as possible. I welcome that challenge. You see, the question of God's existence is of interest not only to religion, but also to philosophy. Now, Mr. Hitchens has made it clear that he despises and disdains religion, but presumably he is not so contemptuous of philosophy. Therefore, as a professional philosopher, I'm going to approach tonight's question philosophically, from the standpoint of reason and argument. I'm convinced that there are better arguments for theism than for atheism. So in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there's no good argument that atheism is true. And secondly, that there are good arguments that theism is true. Now, notice carefully the circumscribed limits of those contentions. We're not here tonight to debate the social impact of religion or Old Testament ethics or biblical inerrancy. All interesting and important topics, no doubt, but not the subject of tonight's debate, which is the existence of God. Consider then my first contention, that there's no good argument that atheism is true. Atheists have tried for centuries to disprove the existence of God, but no one's ever been able to come up with a successful argument. So rather than attack straw men at this point, I'll just wait to hear Mr. Hitchens present his arguments against God's existence, and then I'll respond to them in my next speech. In the meantime, let's turn to my second main contention, that there are good arguments that theism is true. On your program insert, I outlined some of those arguments. Number one, the cosmological argument. The question of why anything at all exists is the most profound question of philosophy. The philosopher Derek Parfit says, no question is more sublime than why there is a universe, why there is anything, rather than nothing. Typically, atheists have answered this question by saying that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophically and scientifically, to think that the universe began to exist. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past seems absurd. Just think about it. If the universe never began to exist, That means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. This shows that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, wrote, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." But that entails that since past events are not just ideas, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ian Young and I'm the Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Australian National University and to introduce our esteemed guests, Professor Richard Dawkins, in conversation with Professor Lawrence Krauss. Tonight's event
at the Sydney Opera House on Monday. And in the middle, we'll both be attending the Global Atheist Convention in Melbourne, the largest convention of atheists in the world. I should begin with some housekeeping details. First of all, the way this is going to work is that Richard and I are going to have a conversation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then after we're finished, the floor will be open for questions, and there are microphones at either end of the auditorium, and also up in the second level, so you don't have to jump down. And we'll go on as long as the questions are interesting. And the format of the conversation is somewhat unusual, perhaps, but about 5 years ago, Richard and I were asked to speak together at Stanford University in the United States. And Richard insisted that we do it without a moderator, because as he pointed out, moderators always stop things just when they're getting interesting. So we've tried to have some conversations without a moderator, and that's what we're going to do tonight. And we're never quite certain where they're going to go, and we will see. We have some ideas of topics we'd like to discuss, but we'll see where they go. I actually want to begin, Richard, speaking of moderators. Some of you may have watched TV last night. And did you see Q&A, a few of you? Yes. Well, it was an interesting, well, I don't know whether interesting is the way to describe it, but it was a program that I want to spend a little time talking about, and maybe you might want to comment on some of your concerns about that program.
Well, I suppose my first concern arose when I was announced and the audience went, and then Cardinal Pell was announced and it went, rah, rah, rah. And I couldn't help feeling that this was not exactly a representative audience of Australia. I don't know how the studio audience is chosen for Q&A, but I had my suspicions at the time, which I think have rather been confirmed, that there was some fairly smart footwork, which I suppose they're rather good at, and maybe we're not so good at, and maybe we should
learn how to stack the audience.
Learn how it's done. You've got to be a bit politically savvy. But I think that more importantly, going back to your point, Lawrence, about moderators, I really did think last night the moderator got in the way, because we could have had a searching conversation, which I would have enjoyed, but just as it got going, and just as the Archbishop had dealt himself enough rope to hang himself, the moderator jumped in with moving on to the next question and as it were, rescued him in the nick of time. And so I thought that was a fairly good illustration of why we don't want moderators. And the same thing happened, oddly enough, in England a few weeks ago when I had a similar onstage conversation, not televised in this case, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, dare I say, by contrast, is a very, very nice man. And once again, there was a moderator who kept on getting in the way. In that case, it wasn't to get the next question from the audience. In that case, it was to utter some philosophical profundity, which didn't actually help matters along. But I've noticed again and again that chairmen get in the way, and it's better if you can do it to have just a plain conversation.
He certainly did save, on a number of occasions, save the Cardinal, who it was my first experience listening to the man. He seemed entirely devoid of intellect. True, I was shocked. I was shocked. And what I thought we might do is, because of, he demonstrated a number of misconceptions about science as well as religion, as far as I could see, and hadn't thought much about either. And I thought we might want to start talking about fill in some of the gaps that happened last night. For example, I was amazed with his understanding of evolution.
Well, yes, the chairman asked him, did he accept that humans were descended from apes? I think
yeah, that's what he put it.
And he said, yes, from Neanderthals. We're not descended from Neanderthals, we're cousins of Neanderthals. I told him that. So he said, more or less, well, how can we be cousins if they're extinct?
You know, I actually, at that point, and I think he then asked you, have you ever met a Neanderthal? And I must admit, I would have just said, I'm talking to one right now. But I think, it is one of the biggest misconceptions about evolution, in the sense of how it works. And the idea of speciation is a very non-intuitive concept, which is one of the reasons that I think many people have problems with evolution as a concept, because it doesn't happen on a human time scale. And I've testified before school boards in the United States about trying to keep evolution in the schools, which are constantly, there's a battle all the time to try and get rid of evolution. And I'm always told, why aren't I seeing apes turn into humans right now?
Yeah.
And it's a constant harangue. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, that is one of the commonest things. I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey turning into a human. It's as though they think it happens overnight. And it is true that it's very, very hard to grasp the sheer immensity of the timescale that's involved. We as humans are used to a timescale of years, decades, centuries we can just about cope with, even millennia, but then millennia start to feel a bit kind of mysterious and, lost in the mists of time. 1,000,000 years is something we can't really grasp. 100 million years is something completely beyond our comprehension. And there have been various attempts to dramatize it, things like, representing the whole of the span of life by 24-hour clock, and humans appear, I don't know what it is, 5 minutes before midnight or whatever it is. Another one is when you hold out your hand, your arm, and you say the middle of your neck is the origin of life. And then it's all bacteria out to about there. And then dinosaurs come in about there. And fossil humans, sort of recognizably Homo sapiens, come in about the tip of your fingernail. And the whole of human history, the whole of recorded history, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, the Romans, the Greeks, all falls in the dust of one stroke of the nail file. That's not my own, that's somebody else's, but I think it's rather a good one. And you can't really get to grips with evolution unless you realize what an enormous amount of time that there is. And it's quite clear, I think, that the Cardinal didn't really understand. But that, we are actually descended not just from apes, but we're descended from fish, we're descended from bacteria.
But also even the question, I thought, by the way it was put by the moderator, we're descended from apes, gives the impression that we are descended from creatures that now exist contemporaneously with us, which of course is not the case.
That's one of the commonest misconceptions. And you hear it in the form of, well, if we're descended from chimpanzees, how come there are still chimpanzees? We're not descended from chimpanzees. Even if we were, there's no reason why they shouldn't go on living with us. Doesn't mean they have to go extinct.
Although we seem to do a very good job of making things extinct that are going with us.
Well, that's true. I mean, you could say if North Americans are descended from Europeans, how come there are still Europeans?
Excellent.
Or Australians, for that matter.
Well, you know, as ignorant, I personally took affront to something the Cardinal
I
said.
bet you did.
Yeah. Because as ignorant as he was of biology, he was, what upset me was he was disingenuously ignorant about, and I thought ungracious to you, in fact, in that context.
Well, that's I think, I mean, there was the question that came from the audience where somebody said, I'm holding nothing in my fist, and you can't make something out of nothing. I mean, which of course was a reference to Lawrence's book, Something from Nothing. The whole point about modern physics is that you can't do it by common sense. That's why you need physicists. If you could do
we
it
have
by
no
common sense,
that's really
yeah,
it.
if you could do it by common sense, you wouldn't need Lawrence. So
I'll take that as a compliment, Richard.
yeah. So it is very clear from reading reviews of your book, Something from Nothing. It's well. First of all, I should say that I was very proud to have written the afterword to this book. I was accused last night by Cardinal Pell of not having read the book because he said you wrote the foreword and you evidently didn't get to the end. If he'd read the book, he'd have known that I did not write the foreword.
In fact, that's the thing that I objected the most. I don't mind ignorance so much. It's the illusion of knowledge that upsets me more. And in fact, he has to be held responsible, and I'm happy we're going to Sydney because I plan to hold him responsible for criticizing a book that he clearly had read, and that was a clear example of it. He quoted verbatim from a review by a philosopher of my book, and of course totally bungled it, totally distorted. But the first part he said 6 pages before the end of the book, which was how this review in the New York Times began. But the key idea, which really is so difficult and I guess challenging and perhaps threatening to both some philosophers as well as theologians, is this question of something from nothing. As it happens in the case, as I think we've talked about before, in biology. I mean, how do you get life from non-life? That was originally sort of the main theological question. How do you get life from non-life? And even in the original version of Darwin's book, he says at the very end, God breathed life into the first species because...
Only in the first edition.
Only in the first edition.
In second edition, he leaves out God. Oh, no, the other way around. Sorry.
Yeah, you put it back in because that's right.
In the first edition, there's no mention of God. He says, originally breathed. And then in the second edition and subsequent editions, he says, by the Creator. But that's a much easier problem in a way, because you're starting with chemistry. You start from molecules bumbling around in the warm little pond, as Darwin called it, primeval soup, as people later called it. And then you get the first self-replicating molecule. But something from nothing, from literally nothing, and that's what really gets people. That's the one that's really counter to common sense. And they clearly misunderstand what you mean by nothing. So
well, exactly. And the problem is I'm often accused of not talking about the nothing that classical philosophers 2,000 years ago or theologians talked about. And the answer is I'm not really interested in their nothing. I'm interested in the real nothing. I'm interested in asking
I too struggle with the notion of an afterlife. Any of us who have stood at the grave of a loved one have had to ask the question, now what? The idea of this evening is to try to explore this question honestly, find answers, and ask more questions that are either comforting or disconcerting. So let's begin. My first question, we decided to forego long opening statements. We're going to make this as conversational and respectful and
dirt on the grave. And I thought this was going to be extraordinarily difficult to take a shovel full of dirt and throw it on the coffin of somebody that I love very dearly. But I actually didn't find it nearly as difficult as I anticipated. And the reason is that I knew that whatever was in that coffin, he wasn't there. But I also knew that that wasn't the same thing as he wasn't. It just meant he wasn't there, but he was, and he is. I just don't know how.
Sam, in The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So picking up a little bit on what David has said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. In my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Yeah, although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. Not the point I was making there, but it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. And so I expressed the spirit of my wife, and she was actually able to put me these. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you. And she said, nothing Hitchens does is ever boring. So I have that going for me. Right? I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Year after year after year. And that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. And think about these children, think about their parents, know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be safe. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality. And as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence, we're going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that. And I think, therefore, that this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, that the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's where I am.
Brad, 3 times a day as a religious Jew, you would pray the Amidah, where you extol the God who resurrects the dead. It says that right in one of the most standard of Jewish prayers. When you say that, what are you saying? What do you believe you're saying?
So I need to take a couple steps back and make this a running jump rather than a standing jump.
Sure.
As I understand it, rather than simply reducing someone's idea to a caricature, which is easy to do on all sides in this kind of a conversation, we live in an age in which there are different plausible ways of making sense and connecting the dots. One of them is a kind of reductionism in which everything can be explained by its smallest physical components. And once you've explained how inert matter operates, then you create more complex systems, but you've done all your explaining really at the very basic subatomic levels. And that's completely plausible, and you can tell the entire story that way in a reasonable way. I don't think it's the only way one can do it. One can also say that there are intimations all the way down of what others have called, and I think of as mindfulness. And that the mindfulness all the way down emerges at some point into consciousness, which emerges at some point beyond that into something even beyond the consciousness we're aware of. And we have abilities to access it, not necessarily by what we know. And here I have to say, having read the books of the authors here, I agreed with almost everything that everyone wrote. People claim knowledge where they can't possibly know. But what I think we can also claim is intuitions that go beyond what we know. Things like hope and trust and loyalty. We ground our lives in them. So there are people who use the afterlife as a way of evading their responsibility. But I know that I and Rabbi Wolpe have sat at the bedside of people who were able to connect with others because this belief inspired them to live each moment with dignity and connection. So for me, the prayer is literally false. Having lived one life with flat feet and fat thighs, I fervently hope that God does not physically resurrect the dead. Although I will tell you, I'm one of the rabbis dancing in Gadi Levi's dance thing. So I expect to have buns of steel by the time you come back for that. But I think it's a metaphor for saying that there is a oneness of which we are an expression, and that does not cease with our death, and that in some very important way, although not one that is reducible to knowledge, I don't claim to know, but I trust that we continue beyond the grave.
Thanks. Christopher, what's wrong with that? If a belief in the afterlife helps one, as Brad said, deal with the inevitability of death, maybe this is a good thing.
Well, then anything that made you feel better would be okay, which I'm sorry to say I think is a contemptible point. Here's the problem with the afterlife fantasy. It's the same as religion in general. If you can't hear, I hope it's not my fault. All right, how's that? Okay. Not to duck the opening question, give myself a chance to repeat my answer. That would mean that anything that made you feel good or better was fine, which I think is a contemptible position, I'm sorry to say. And it would be as good as drugs, for example. And I don't believe, and in fact Marx never said that religion is just an opiate. But religion and the afterlife fantasy have these things in common. First, they're man-made. That's very important. They represent claims by humans to be able to interpret the divine and to give themselves power by doing so. We all admit we don't know. That's because we can't know. So the people who have to leave the island right away are those who say they do, who for centuries have tyrannized and still do millions of human beings by claiming to hold the keys of heaven and hell. Leading to my second point, religion is totalitarian in its practice and its theory. It claims to know things it can't know, and it claims to have powers it cannot have. It says if you make the right propitiations and the right donations, you may get paradise. And if you don't, you may get an eternity of pain. That includes, by the way, the souls of unbaptized children of the millions that Sam mentioned. Then there's, I'm afraid to say, but you also, as you'd expect from the man, made the argument of fraud. St. Peter's in Rome was built on the sale of indulgences. That's to say, in return for cash, the promise of a remission of sin and the time in hell or purgatory. There are chantries, actually quite beautiful ones, still all over Europe, still working. Prayers being said for the repose and remission of souls. Pope Benedict, the most reactionary prelate for a considerable time to leave the church, is trying to restore the idea of remission of sin in exchange for donations or other in-kind operations. This is, I'm sorry if it sounds unduly functionalist, but until we've dealt with these questions, we can't have a serious discussion. Now, there's also, I think, a real problem about anything that's eternal. I should probably close with this. It will happen to all of us that at some point you get tapped on the shoulder and told, not just that the party's over, but slightly worse, the party's going on, but you have to leave. and it's going on without you. That's the reflection, I think, that most upsets people about their demise. All right then, because it might make us feel better, let's pretend the opposite. Instead, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, great news, this party's going on forever, and you can't leave. You've got to stay. The boss says so, and he also insists that you have a good time. I've read about David's father. I had a bad time when my own father passed on, but the father proposed by monotheism is the father who doesn't die, who reassures his children, don't worry, I'll never leave you. You'll never see the end of me. You'll never get the chance to feel sorry. I'm always there. I'm the absolute ultimate in dictatorship. And in my courts, there's no appeal. Do you really think that this would cheer up anyone of sentience or humanity or capable of feeling of irony? I submit it's out of the question.
I just want to say I was completely with you until the end when you got silly on us. And the reason I say that is because you speak about God in the same way that you would speak about a human dictator as though they were equivalent.
Much worse.
Much worse. But it's only worse. It's only worse because of the eternity of it, right? But the characteristics are the same.
No, the absolutism.
The absolutism.
The lack of any appeal.
But that's not.
And the worship of him by his slaves.
Except that that's not at all what any tradition envisions, and even if it did envision it, as you and I think would both agree, the envisioning of traditions of what a god could be are very limited and partial. And so if you want to make it, yes, that it's North Korea forever, then I would say you're belittling the notion of what it means to have a god. You're belittling the notion of what it means to have eternity in, if not bliss, at least reasonable happiness. And it's true that you lose everything in this world, but also it's not at all the case, and you know that it's not the case, that the notion of the afterlife invariably leads to neglect of what is important in this world. Sometimes, in fact, it does the exact opposite. You can take large swaths of belief. You mentioned Marx. Communism, for example, which repudiated the idea of the afterlife and therefore thought you have to create utopia here, and it led it to horrendous misdeeds throughout the 20th century. So the belief in the afterlife can be totalitarian and terrible, but so can the idea that there's nothing after this world and therefore you have to perfect human beings here. It can work both ways.
I wanted to ask you, Christopher, do you really believe that dead is dead? You don't believe in any kind of consciousness going after death? You believe dead is dead?
Okay, the survival of consciousness independent of the brain, which Sam knows more about than I, and we're getting better acquainted with, is quite different from the religious belief in a mandated path by which you can follow or not follow, leading to reward and punishment. Completely different. It's different in the same way as, say, spiritualism was, which wasn't really a religion, but was a very strong, fraudulent movement that not coincidentally flourished after the First World War in the hope of putting people in touch with dead relatives and so forth. Not one single interesting thing ever got said from the other side. Fascinating, you know. Burblings from the beyond, but millions of people pitifully paid attention to it. I guess my answer has to depend on David's point about stuff. We actually know a great deal more than we ever did, than any of our predecessors did, about what stuff we're made of. We know that our DNA gives us enormous amounts in common with other animals, huge amounts. We know that stars had to die. Larry Krauss makes this point very well in his lectures on physics. Stars had to die. One every second blew up, and is still blowing up since the Big Bang. We're made, if you want to call it pretty, from stardust or nuclear waste, depending on your analysis. But there's absolutely no reason to think that those molecules would be worth reassembling. That they will rejoin, as do the animals, and as have done the other species we didn't know about till recently, the other human tribes, the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, the ones that aren't even mentioned in any holy book. They only died out about 20,000 years ago. Who has heaven and hell for them? It's as likely for us as it is, I think, for any other dog, whale, or bacteria.
Well,
and no more than that.
Sam, what does it mean when you write that you think that consciousness may indeed survive?
Well, there are many odd ways in which consciousness could survive, and in way you can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom, one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is at bottom the result of information processing at the level of the brain, and there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads, and that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes, and therefore we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now, again, this everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions that you have to take on board are not so weak. And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if in fact we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, this computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore, all religions could be true in this simulated universe. And we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect. So now all of that sounds completely crazy, but it is not as crazy as the version of the afterlife that is really on offer traditionally, which has been actually neatly sidestepped here because it entails the resurrection of the dead. Most people think that the afterlife religion is offering, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has something to do with the soul floating off the brain into a tunnel of light and into paradise. But that's actually not the canonical afterlife. The canonical afterlife is God has to do the humble work of reassembling us. And I don't want to take more than a lot of time here, but I think we should talk about just how implausible that vision is, because that actually is the vision of theism and Christianity.
I just want to make one quick addendum. There's also, who I thought you were going to talk about, is Galen Strawson. I mean, another Oxford philosopher who says that consciousness is actually so impossible philosophically to figure out that it must be that it exists even in inanimate matter, even though it doesn't seem that way. So I don't think that it's, but let's leave aside how difficult consciousness is to figure out without some sort of either strange hypothesis or spirit. Yes, it's true that much of Judaism talks about resurrection, much of it talks about afterlife, but there are there's a plurality of voices. And I mean, the Talmud says, for example, you assume that the sages are in paradise, but it is not so. In fact, paradise is in the sages. That's not the sort of voice that generally you hear when the literalist view of an afterlife is attacked. And for more on that, I turn to my colleague, Rabbi Brad Artson.
I would actually love for us all to go out to coffee and leave them aside so that we could say things like, wow, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about that. And what do you do with this? Rather than the scoring of points. And so there's a lot of cleverness and there are a lot of quips. But at the end of it, what it sounds like we're saying is that religion is a monolith, and the worst of religion is compared to the best of science, which is fluid and evolving. And I'm halfway there with you. I think one of the greatnesses of science is its capacity to be self-reflective and its capacity to change convictions. But the wreckage of scientific error is fairly impressive. And the diversity of religious thought is also, I think, undergirded. Unfortunately, I think in part because we all had bad religious education as kids and we're still in recovery. So,
but Bradley, I want to accept your challenge, but what do you, I mean, is Maimonides the worst of religion? Maimonides came right out and said you have to believe in the resurrection as a literal
yes, and
truth.
Maimonides also said that what I've written in my book is disguised so that people will, if they need literalism, latch onto it and miss what I'm trying to say. And he also said that we call the world to come because we don't experience it during this lifetime, but eternity exists at the present. And if you attain a great consciousness, you can be in eternity now. So the challenge is we all come to it with our own different concrete needs, but religion is, I think, far more nuanced. And I guess the plea I would like to offer to you, because the parts of your book, both of you gentlemen, that I agreed with was everything you trashed religion for, it deserves to be trashed for. I have an autistic son, and if I believed in that bully in the sky, I would have to tell Dr. Wexler that I was leaving my employment. But I don't, and I don't think that my tradition or the Buddhist tradition or the richness of Hindu tradition understood in a nuanced and ethical way is any more problematic than science's capacity to learn from its mistakes and to move on. And the way the Bible is used in my community with my students is, I would hold up as ethical as anywhere else. And a part of that is the recognition that although we do not know, we hold to hopes that orient us and allow us to value each other as of abiding significance.
Which can be done by anyone who appreciates the supernatural. Look, I don't mind attacking religion at its best if you'd rather I do that. I mean, behind the idea of judgment, remember, which is part of the deal of the afterlife and the reward of heaven and hell, is some rough concept of justice, that there's an equalization of the odds against which we struggled when we were alive, that the tears are dried, and that the wrongdoing is punished. Very, very old wellspring of human aspiration. Why do the wicked prosper? I would really like to know. And why, as Hamlet says, so much contumely is heaped on the patient and the meek. Now, the reason why Sam's Oxonian friend disturbs us when he elaborates is we don't like to think that we're just digitized by someone else's brain, that we're rats in some maze, someone else's maze. Nor, though, rather interestingly, do we like to think that everything that happens to us is random. We repudiate both ideas. They're both equally distressing. But the reason why I started with my totalitarian point is this. Take the case that I still can't get out of my mind. You remember reading about it, the woman in Austria who was kept in a cellar by her father for 30 years and raped every day and bore him children who he raped also. Picture how she must have prayed, how she must have wearied heaven with her prayers, and how accidental was her release that we even know about. You're told those tears will be dry, that'll be compensated. In other words, that has to mean her suffering was part of the plan. We let that happen. Yes, we did know. We do take responsibility. That was part of the design, but it'll be better later. I think that makes her suffering meaningless, and in fact rather obscene. We'll do that to her, but we'll make it up later on. Take another great Austrian, now deceased, born in Braunau on the Inn, and dead in May, I think, 1945. Yes, that was all part of the plan too, but believe me, we'll see to it that he's punished for it. Now, if you don't mind my saying so, Rabbi, that kind of thinking seems to me to materialize both the worst in the concept, the horrible idea of the human being as an experimental object in a design that's opaque to us, where we're played with, and to maximize the horror of randomness. Pick one Austrian, make him very nearly the ruler of whole Europe, the whole of Europe. Another Austrian, and keep her as a prisoner of her rapist father for 3 decades. And that's all part of the plan too. So it's maximizing chaos, and it's maximizing tyranny and deliberate cruelty. And that's why I think reason has to repudiate this whole means of thinking. Reason and justice too, actually.
As I'm sure it would if religion thought that way. But
answer the most fundamental of questions about life, our existence itself, which is, of course, the main core area that we're going to be addressing tonight in this auditorium in London here tonight. I remember, spending a large part of my life asking myself, why am I here? Who created me? Do I have a purpose? Can we be certain about any of these, these questions? And once, I asked a bishop, what's the purpose of life? And he said to me, go and do a theology degree. Right, I'm not telling you to go and do a theology degree. I'm asking you to sit here in a debate for 2 hours with my 2 honorable guests over here. Yeah, well, I'll ask you later. Well, of course, he didn't know the answer, by the way. Right. That's another issue. But what, of course, we can do to inform our decisions about this debate tonight is to use our reasoning, to use our minds, to use our intellect, and really for us to have an open mindset. Muslim, non-Muslim, Christian, whatever you are, whatever you believe in, we should have an open mindset and really go at this with sincerity. That's really, I'm just asking I'm asking myself first and foremost, right? Because that's tough being an ex-Irish Catholic. Yes, yeah. Oh, well, that's another story. This evening, 2 major belief systems, if you like, lay claim to the truth of going head to head. No matter which side of the fence that you tend to reside on, okay, by the end of the night, that you will be better informed about atheism and about Islam. Hopefully the world perspective, the world view of Islam and atheism. That's what it's really all about. Tonight, how's it gonna hang? Right. Well, we're gonna have 25 minutes allotted for both speakers, although I'm told that that's gonna change as well. Okay, and then followed by a further 10 minutes of, sort of coming back, and then another 3 minutes of coming back, although that might change better, right? And after that, there will be, crossfire, and there's going to be no heavy arms to be utilized in this section, both of you, okay? Although I understand the tongue is a lot more vicious than nuclear weapon. But what we're effectively saying after that is that you lovely people will get the opportunity to ask questions, as make observations, hopefully on the topics, right? On the topic that we're talking about, and then there'll be 2 minutes closing remarks, a little presentation after that, and we'll all go home, and we've got to be out of here by 10 o'clock. I would urge the audience not to heckle the speakers, to be polite at all times, okay? And, to listen to each other afterwards as well. We don't want any blood or any fights, okay? And I'm sure that you guys, you understand why I'm saying that. So today, our first speaker, okay, been agreed upon? Okay, good, okay. Hey, you want to go first? Will be our brother, well, you say brother, he's a brother in humanity. You're my brother in humanity. He's my brother in humanity and in the faith of Islam. Okay. Okay, fine. It means God is great. Okay. So Hamza Andreas Dorsis, of course, he's actually Greek, not Pakistani. Please, he in fact is, you can see he's a little bit Pakistani, but anyway, he's a student of Islamic thought, a lecturer, a researcher for the Islamic Education Research Academy, and without further ado, I will call upon him to give his piece.
إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Indeed, respected Mr. Kraus, guests, brothers and sisters, friends, relatives, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Which basically means, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Today's question, Islam or atheism, which makes more sense? I would argue that if we use our reason, our rational faculties, we will definitely come to the conclusion that Islam makes more sense. And I'm going to use 2 simple arguments to verify that claim. Argument number 1, Islam makes sense of the origins of the universe. Argument number 2, Islam makes sense of the nature of the Quranic discourse. So let me go straight to the first argument, that Islam makes sense of the origins of the universe. Now, we all have had the same type of questions, or most of us anyway. Why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And in response to that question, the grandfather of neo-atheism, Bertrand Russell, said, the universe is just there, and that's all. It's a brute fact. Even in Islamic history, as early as the 8th century, we had philosophical naturalists known as the Dahriya. They held similar views. Now, the implications of these historical opinions is that the universe is eternal. And if the universe is eternal, it implies there is an infinite past. But the question is, can we have an infinite past? Does the infinite make sense in the real world? Now, the assertion that the universe has an infinite past is absolutely irrational. This is because the quantifiable infinite cannot exist in the real world, something our beloved Professor Krauss has also suggested in his book, A Universe from Nothing, on page 71. He says clearly, the energy of empty space, or anything else for that matter, cannot physically be infinite. So we have to figure out a way to do the calculation to get a finite answer. Now, to highlight why the infinity or the infinite doesn't exist, take the following examples into consideration. Imagine we have, for example, an infinite number of Professor Kraus's in this room. And if I were to take 5 Professor Kraus's away, how many do we have left? Well, some mathematicians may say, well, we still have an infinite number of Professor Kraus's. Logicians will say, we have infinity minus 5. But what stops me practically removing 5 Professor Kraus's away from this room? Nothing. And if I do, there should be less than infinite, but there isn't. Therefore, it leads to absurdities and contradictions. Take this other example into consideration. The distance between myself and Professor Krauss. We can potentially split this distance into infinite parts, but I can actually traverse the finite distance, which shows, as Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, said, that the infinite is potential, never actualized. And in light of this, mathematicians Kasman and Newman said, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. And this leads to our deductive argument. Now, for those who don't know, a deductive argument is a conclusion that necessarily follows from its premises. And to deny a valid and sound deductive argument is equivalent of denying reality. So listen to the deductive argument. Number one, an actual infinite cannot exist. Number two, an infinite history of past events is an actual infinite. Therefore, an infinite history of past events cannot exist. Therefore, the universe is finite. Therefore, it had a beginning. Now, this is a deductive argument. But we also have complementary evidence, which I call astrophysical evidence. And I'm not claiming to be a physicist. We have an established, acclaimed academic amongst us, so he could tell us the rest of the story. But what have cosmologists said? They have said, for example, Alexander Vilenkin, in his book, Many Worlds in One, which I believe is a friend of Professor Krauss, he says, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And just to know, even Professor Krauss in his book affirms a beginning to the universe. Interestingly, in Islamic thought, this has been discussed at length, and there is a unanimous conclusion that the universe is eternal. It began in the finite past, as the polymath, theologian, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote in the 14th century in his book, As-Safadiyya. So whatever is besides God, it is all makhluk, all created, originated, coming to be after not existing, preceding by its own existence. Now, since we have shown that the universe must have a beginning, there are four logical explanations for how the universe began to exist. Number one, it was created via nothing. Number two, it created itself. Number three, it was created by something else that was created. And number four, it was created by something uncreated. Let's discuss these together. Could the universe be created via nothing? Well, first and foremost, what do we mean by nothing? By nothing, we mean the absence of something, and in this case, the absence of the universe. Now, why does our definition make sense? This is because we have deductively argued that the universe began, and therefore it was once not there. There was an absence of the universe. This is undeniable due to the deductive nature of the argument. So based on our definition, I think we can conclude that the universe coming into being or existence by nothing is impossible on logical, rational, and I would even argue empirical grounds. You could discuss this mathematically, for example. What is 0 plus 0 plus 0? It's never going to be 3. It's 0. Therefore, the universe could not have come into existence via nothing. As P.J. Zwart in his publication About Time explains, if there is anything we can find inconceivable, it is that something could arise from nothing. Let's go to the next option. Could the universe create itself? Well, this implies that the universe was in existence and not in existence at the same time, which is an impossibility. Also, there's a crude example for you to picture in your mind. Ask yourself the question, can your mother give birth? Obviously not. So we know self-creation is an impossibility. So the next option is, could the universe be created by something created? Well, I would argue as an ultimate explanation for how the universe began, this is illogical and irrational. The universe could not be as a result of another universe, for example, or something else that was created because of the absurdity of an infinite regress. Imagine this universe, universe 1, being as a result of another universe, universe 2, and universe 2 being as a result of another universe, universe 3, and this one ad infinitum, we will never have the universe today. Hence, the Islamic philosopher and thinker, Dr. Jafar Ibris, summarizes this point. He says, there will be no series of actual causes, but only a series of non-existence. The fact, however, is that there are existence around us. Therefore, the ultimate cause must be something other than temporal causes. So I would argue that the final possible explanation, which is the universe was created by something uncreated, is the most rational explanation. And the philosopher Abraham Varghese, in the appendix to Professor Anthony's book, There is a God, explains this conclusion in a simple but forceful way. He writes, now, clearly, theists and atheists can agree on one thing. If anything exists at all, there must be something preceding it that always existed. How did this eternally existing reality come to be? The answer is that it never came to be. It always existed. Take your pick, the God or the universe. Something always existed. And we argue deductively that the universe began, therefore it couldn't have always existed. Now, this doesn't mean God exists. It doesn't mean Allah, Buddha, Jesus, Yahweh exists. Of course not. That's a leap of faith. We leave that to the atheists. The point I'm trying to make here is that if we continue with our rational argumentation, using our aql meaning intellect in the Arabic language of the Quranic discourse says, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, do not use your brain. If we continue using our brains, our minds, we will conclude something quite profound. Number one, that this uncreated creator must be eternal by definition because he's uncreated. Number two, he must be transcendent. As Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century philosopher and theologian, said, he must be distinct and destroying from the universe. For example, if I were to create this lectern, do I become the lectern? No. Number three, this uncreated creator must have a will, because if it's eternal and brought into existence a finite effect that began, like the universe, he must have chose the universe to come into existence. And the choice indicates a will, and a will indicates it can have a relationship with sentient beings in the universe. Number four, it must be powerful. It created the atom, for example. Split the atom, ask Professor Krauss what happened. Fifth point, it must be perpetually knowing, because if it's eternal and it established laws like the law of gravity, it implies a lawgiver. So therefore, we can make the inference that it's perpetually knowing or perpetually intelligent, because it's eternal and created laws in the universe. Finally, it must be one. If we use the rational principle of Occam's razor, and by the way, many people don't understand Occam's razor, and I think Professor Krauss doesn't understand Occam's razor either when I read his book, but he could debate with me later. Occam's razor is not about physical causes, by the way, which has been misconstrued as a straw man in the Kraussian fashion. Basically, Occam's razor is that you must have a simple explanation, but also you must have the most comprehensive, which means what? It actually means that it has to have greater explanatory scope and explanatory power. It can be complex because it may deal with most of the questions. But concerning this reality about the oneness of the divine, the argument that the creator must be one is simple and far more comprehensive. If you say 2 or 3 or 4, then it's not simple anymore, and it doesn't answer all the questions. In actual fact, it creates far more questions than it answers, such as how do 2, 3, 4 causes co-eternally exist? It doesn't make any sense. So I think we've concluded what the Quran concluded 1400 years ago, that there is a creator, he's one, he's unique, he's transcendent. As the Quran says in the 112th chapter, say, he is God, the one, the unique, God, the eternal, absolute. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and there is nothing like unto him. Now, before I move on to my next argument, I really want to have a nuanced discussion, a very nuanced discussion, which means if someone offers to talk to you, you have to talk to them back. And I wasn't offended, but I found it slightly childish when I asked someone in this room for us to have a chat. And you want to have a chat with me, which I think is not very nice. So that's another story. And I want to do some contention so we transcend this kind of what I would call atheist cliches. So what's the first atheist cliche? The first atheist cliche, I call it the Professor Krauss nothing cliche. And if you read his book, you will see that Professor Krauss was a highly acclaimed academic. I mean, I'm nothing compared to him. He's right. One second. By the way, him making a statement is not an argument. I don't know why you're clapping like someone who's obedient slave. 1 point. Please, I have a time to keep. So, in his book, which I really like his book, I like his style, I like his rhetoric, he wrote in his book, Universe from Nothing, he said that nothing is nothing with italics. And essentially what he's trying to say, he's trying to change the label nothing, which in the English language is a universal negation. But he's saying nothing is actually something, which is a quantum reality. And this is quite bizarre. And that's why you have to study philosophy, because you need to make conceptual distinctions. For example, imagine I was in the hallway and I said, I make nobody. And they gave me directions to this room. Or imagine if I said, for example, yesterday my wife made a great lunch and it was nothing. Nothing tastes great with a bit of whipped cream. I mean, does this make any sense? And Professor Krauss' use of nothing is actually something he also says in his book in page 80, our universe will then turning to the quantum haze from which our own existence may have begun. And his own friend, Alexander Vilenkin, said recently, vacuum is very different from nothing. It's a physical object. But this is irrelevant almost, because even Krauss admits in his book that these are speculative and inconclusive conclusions. Because he says, I stress the word could here, because we may never have enough empirical information to resolve this question unambiguously. So I do respect what he's trying to do, but you would never take an inductive argument over a deductive one. Only someone intellectually challenged would do that, in my humble opinion. The second contention is that things can come into being without any cause. You have a quantum vacuum, a quantum reality, and there are some subatomic events that appear without no causes. I believe we have a strong defeater to this argument. It concerns perception, and it rests on a Kantian argument. Now, I can order my perception in this room. I can see this very handsome young man. I can see the cameraman. I can see the wall. I can also reverse that perception. But if my wife were to start walking down this auditorium, I couldn't help but see her front before I see her back, and I couldn't reverse that perception. Now, the very fact that I know when I can order my perceptions when I can't, and when I can reverse my perceptions when I can't, is because we have an innate concept of causal links and causal connection. To reject that based on empiricism or empirical reality is equivalent and tantamount of actually rejecting the perception itself. It's like shooting yourself in the foot. This is why the philosopher John Cottingham, in his book Rationalism, said that on Kant's argument, we will not be able to recognize the event in the first place unless there were a rule that makes it necessary that the order of our perception should be thus and not otherwise. In short, the very experience of an external event already presupposes an understanding of causal necessity. So these are the cliches. Let's go to the next argument, which is the nature of the Quran. Now, the Quranic discourse has been described by Eastern and Western scholars as an intrusive and imposing text, which seeks to intrude into the inner dimensions of man. Now, this imposition is positive as the Quran seeks to positively engage with your intellect and with your psychological disposition. And the way the Quran achieves this is by asking questions. And in themselves, do they not see? Talks about the physiological reality, the psychological reality, even referring to things like consciousness. This is why Professor of Philosophy Shabir Akhtar, in his book, The Quran and the Secular Mind, a Philosophy of Islam, he describes what the Quran is trying to say with these verses. He says, nature's flawless harmonies and the delights and liabilities of our human environment, with its diverse and delicate relationships, are invested with religious significance. Created nature is a cryptogram of a reality which transcends it. Nature is a text to be deciphered, evidences accumulating in the material and social worlds, and in the horizons jointly point to a hidden immaterial order. You may think this is quite interesting for a 7th century book, but the Quran goes even further than this. It produces an intellectual challenge for the whole of mankind. The Quran says, وَإِن كُنتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِمَّا نَزَلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And if you are in doubt, so to grasp, to even everybody, if you doubt this book, which we have sent down to our servant, referring to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon whom be peace, then bring one chapter like it and call your witnesses and supporters besides God in kuntum sadiqin. If you're truthful in this claim. Now this verse is the basis for an array of arguments in the Quranic discourse, and we don't have time to talk about all the arguments. Historical arguments, sociological arguments, and a whole array of intellectual responses. But one I want to talk about is called the inimitability and the uniqueness concerning the Arabic language in the Quranic discourse, which Islamic theologians and thinkers argue that it is a miracle. Now, before I get into that, we have to now discuss what is a miracle. We have to define what a miracle is. Now, the word itself linguistically comes from the Latin word miraculum, meaning something wonderful. And the traditional Western philosophical definition of a miracle, as summarized by David Hume in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he says it's a transgression of natural law. We don't agree with that definition. Because what are natural laws? Natural laws are just inductive generalizations of patterns that we see in the universe. If something changes from the pattern is different, then maybe it's part of the pattern, it's just based on induction. What the profound Islamic theologians and thinkers have done, they've redefined what a miracle is based on the Quranic discourse. And they have said that a miracle is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature, which means when you go to the nature of the event, you exhaust all possible naturalistic explanations. And also, there is no naturalistic causal link between the event and the nature of the event. And this is a far more coherent definition. Let me give you an example from the Quran itself. Now, the Quran talks about Moses, Musa, alayhi salam, upon him be peace, and Pharaoh in the Quran. Moses was told to throw down his wooden staff, and it instantaneously turned into a live snake. Now, this miraculous event, the snake, lies outside the productive capacity of the nature of the event, the wooden staff, because the chemical makeup of the staff is different to that of the snake. In actual fact, you have to add more stuff to the staff, if that makes sense, stuff to the staff, to be even close of creating a snake, but only the staff was used. So when we exhaust naturalistic explanation, we find there is no causal link between the staff and the snake itself. This gives us a definition of what a miracle is. Now, this applies to the Quran's use of the Arabic language, because the Quran cannot be described as any of the literary forms of the Arabic language, which include tajah, rhyme prose, mursal, straightforward speech, maqama, a combination of metrical and non-metrical speech, and the al-bihar, the 16 rhythmical patterns of classical Arabic poetry. Now, interestingly, in classical Arabic, every expression falls within the known literary forms of the Arabic language. The Quran, however, descopes the Arabic language. And the Quran is a miracle from this perspective, because even though it's made up of the Arabic language, there is no causal link between the Arabic language and the Arabic in the Quran. This is because when we exhaust the 28 letters, the finite grammatical rules, and the finite words, we exhaust them, we cannot produce the unique literary form of the Quranic discourse. And interestingly, from a historical and literary perspective, when attempts have been made to produce the like of the literary form of the Quranic discourse, they have all failed. As the academic Foster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, a notable British Orientalist, states, and that those several attempts have been made to produce a work equal to it as far as elegant writing is concerned, none have yet succeeded. In this light, brothers and friends, what we just discussed can develop into deductive argument. And listen very carefully. Number one, a miracle is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature. In other words, there are no causal links between the event and the nature of the event. Number two, the Quran's literary form lies outside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language. Its literary form cannot be logically explained using the Arabic language. Therefore, the Quran is a miracle. As Professor Bruce Lawrence from Duke University's book, The Quran, Biography, page number 8 said, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of inexplicable truth. They signify meaning, later in meaning, life upon life, miracle after miracle. We have two key arguments that are based on deduction, not just induction, and to challenge a deductive argument, we have to challenge the premises, and I hope for the class to do that. Let's go to some contention. What about Shakespeare? Shakespeare's unique, but this is a very shallow contention. And I even heard this from Dan Barker in our debate in Minnesota, and he didn't do his reading. Basically, Shakespeare is not unique from the perspective of the structural features of language, the literary form, rather it's aesthetic perception. The kind of argument we're talking about, the structural features of the Arabic language. If you look at Shakespeare, he used the iambic pentameter, the brocade verse, the blank verse, and many English literators use the same kind of structures. And if you go to the book, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, you see that Shakespeare has been compared to
100 scientific papers and 9 publications books, including the international bestseller, The Physics of Star Trek, and his most recent bestseller entitled Universe from Nothing, now being translated into 17 languages or more. Professor Krauss, I call upon you to respond.
Well, first I want to thank the people who invited me, who've been very gracious to me, and treated me with more hospitality than I've gotten in many, many times I've talked. So I guess it's Sabia, who I haven't met, and Obeida, who's been taking care of me for the last day or two, and Isa, who I was just working with. And so I do want to thank them tremendously. They showed me great respect and hospitality, and I want to show them and you that kind of respect. And that doesn't mean I respect ideas. Okay? Some ideas are ridiculous, and that's perfectly reasonable. In fact, ridiculing ideas is what makes progress. So if I offend some of you, I don't mean to offend you personally. I may offend some of your ideas, but that doesn't bother me at all. Just in fact, if you confront my ideas, it will lead to a discussion. What does offend me, of course, is offending personal freedom and equal rights, and that's one of the reasons why I got upset at the beginning of the session. But that's been fixed, and I thank the organizers for that as well, to agreeing to not segregate this room in the 21st century is a great step forward, and I appreciate that. Now, I'm really shocked. First of all of the, I've watched Mr. Sorsis, right? Sorsis. My Greek is pretty good, right? Yeah, gorgeous. Well, you are rather gorgeous. Gorgeous George over here. I watched some of these, and they're always exactly the same. So I thought they'd be different this time. And it's always begins with you, and I'm supposed to respond to you. And I will to some extent, but it's hard to respond to nonsense. And in fact, the point of this is is not a question, does God exist? That's not the question. It's atheism or Islam or atheism, which is more sensible, I think is what it says, or something like that. Now, I was just shocked because I thought that you wouldn't bother to try and pretend you knew science, because you don't, and we're going to go through that in real detail. Everything you said is nonsense when it comes to science, so we'll go through and we'll have a little chat if that's okay. Okay, good. And so I found it remarkable that you began with that kind of nonsense, and we'll continue from that. But let me just first begin with the fact that the premise of this debate is in some sense inappropriate, because it suggests two things. First of all, it suggests that Islam is something special, and it isn't. It's not special at all. It's one of 1,000 religions or more that have existed since the dawn of humanity, all of which claim divine revelation, all of which claim perfection, all of which proclaim infinite knowledge, uniqueness, beauty, etc. So Islam is just a religion like any other religion. And there's no difference. It proclaims, just as the Rig Veda did and Akhenaten in ancient Egypt, that the universe had a beginning, nothing special, okay? There's absolutely nothing special. The question is, Islam as one of 1,000 religions, all of which make the same claims, but mutually inconsistent ones. So one of the things we know is, of these 1,000 religions, they all make mutually inconsistent claims, so they can't all be correct. In fact, at best, one of them can be correct, because they're not consistent with each other. So that means a priori, just a priori, and I know you like that term instead of a posteriori. I've heard you say that. A priori, Islam has a probability of 0.1% of being correct, because it's just one of 1,000 religions, and one of them at most is correct. But since they all make the same claims, it's probable that none of them are correct. So treating Islam specially is inappropriate. Then atheism is somehow, as has been described, a belief system. It's not a belief system like Islam or Judaism or Christianity or the Norse myths or Zeus or Thor or any of the other myths that have been created throughout human history. All it's saying is, it's not a belief system. It's saying, you know what? We don't choose to believe that stuff because it's not sensible. So it's not saying we believe X. It's saying, well, this myth is inconsistent with this myth, or this myth is inconsistent with what we know about the universe, and therefore, it's unlikely to be true. So what atheism is, it's just saying, this is unlikely to be true. It's not a belief system. So to compare one versus the other is, of course, false. It's a false premise. The first part of the false premise is that atheism is that Islam is special. Not special at all. Been there, it'll be gone, or be there as long as other religions. It's just like all the rest. And atheism is not a religion. It's just, in fact, what it is could be described as common sense. Okay, what makes sense? I will think that those things that make sense are likely, and those things that don't make sense are unlikely. In fact, that's what science is all about. Okay, so having said that there's nothing special about Islam, and there certainly isn't. I'm going to talk a little bit about, my intent, by the way, is, the other thing I should say is, debates, I'm an educator. It's, a flaw, but it is what it is. That means I believe in actually trying to illuminate ideas and lead to discussion, critical thinking, and eventually learning things and increase in knowledge. Debates aren't meant for that. Debates are rhetorical devices for people to go out and perform, make statements, and then challenge others and try and convince an audience of something. That's not education. So I will talk a little bit about some of this, and then I just want to have a chat. I'm going to use my 25 minutes to have a little chat. I'll take up my time when I could pontificate, as we've heard, and just ask some questions, because I'd actually like to learn some things. Okay, and hopefully in the process there'll be some education for both of us. So the first thing I want to say, however, I want to clear up some misconceptions. This idea of deductive arguments, which sounds good, it's not the way we learn about reality. Okay, deductive arguments just don't work. They lead to irrational action. In fact, if we decide what common sense is taking your beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality so that you will make
rational action. If you force your reality to conform to your beliefs, you will make it irrational. So you can deduce things based on your beliefs, on your a priori beliefs, but you'll have a problem. For example, your a priori belief could be that if you prayed to Allah, that you could jump out the fourth story of this window, this building, and you would land safely. Okay, that could be an a priori belief. And in fact, you could deduce based on all your beliefs and all of the evidence that you're a good person, and Allah would take care of you, whatever you want to call it, that you would be fine. I would take the elevator down, and only one of us would be walking at the end. That is not deductive. It's based on empirical evidence. Okay, now, so arguing that something doesn't make sense to you is based on the fact that the assumption that you know what's sensible in advance. But we don't know what's sensible in advance until we explore the world around us. Our common sense derived from the fact that we evolved on the savannah in Africa to avoid lions, not to understand quantum mechanics, for example. As I've often said, common sense, our deductions might suggest that you cannot be in two places at once. That is crazy. But of course, an electron not only can be, but it is. It doesn't make sense because we didn't evolve to know about it. We've learned about it. We force our idea of common sense to change. It's called learning. Some people would rather read an ancient book than learn. And this has been a very good evidence of that. For example, to say something is inconceivable just means you can't conceive it. But the great thing about the universe, and the reason that I do science, is that the universe has a much greater imagination than we do. In fact, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. And that's what's wonderful about the universe. Things that are inconceivable happen all the time. And what that does is that expands our mind. And expanding our minds to conform to the evidence of reality is common sense. And that's what, when you call atheism, that's what that is. That's just saying, I'm going to accept the evidence of reality, and if something seems like it contradicts the evidence of reality or is irrational, I should question it. Now, there are a lot of ideas which gorgeous George over here, no, Mr. Zortis, I think that's number one. I'm trying to learn Zortis, Mr. Zortis. It's okay. Do you speak ancient Arabic, by the way? A bit of grammar. You don't speak it. So your presumption that it's beautiful ancient Arabic is just a presumption. You actually don't know what you're talking about. Okay. Okay. I just wanted to ask that question because I don't speak Turkish. I want to see if you spoke ancient Arabic. Well, I just want to ask, do you speak ancient Arabic? Yes, I do. Fluently? No, but I do speak it. Oh, okay, but not fluently. Okay, go ahead. Well, you know what? There's a real language that you don't speak. It's called the language of mathematics. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about this nonsense about infinity. Let's take something physical. Let's draw a circle and draw a diameter. What's the ratio of the distance of the circle to the diameter? Do you know? Do you know? I know, I'm asking you a question. I want to have a chat. Well, you've demonstrated that, but you ever heard of pi? Oh, do you know what it is? How many decimals does it have? An infinite number. Okay, so the physical distance of the ratio of a diameter of a circle to its circumference is an infinite number. What do you know? Now, when we talk about, what's amazing to me is you quoted Aristotle as the basis of science. Of course, Aristotle was the one that told us objects fall in proportion to their weight because he actually didn't do the experiment. He deduced it based on what he wanted. Galileo, of course, did the experiment, right? And we know, let's do the experiment here. Right. So I'm going to take this object and this object. Aristotle would tell me which should fall first. Will you tell me which should fall first? Yes. You don't know. Okay, look, you were right. Great. Okay, good. Why? Resistance to what? Okay, exactly. Aristotle didn't know that. Yes, he didn't. Okay. Aristotle also claimed that infinity was impossible because indeed, as you pointed out, the distance from you to me could be divided into a half,
and then a quarter, and then an eighth, and then a 16th, and that's an infinite thing. It makes it impossible.
Yes.
Well, the thing that Aristotle didn't know how to do, and you don't know how to do, is to sum an infinite series. 1 plus a half plus a quarter plus an eighth plus a 16th adds up to 2.
Yes.
Okay. So that kind of argument that infinity is impossible, it just doesn't make sense mathematically. Infinities do occur. Now, it is true in my book that I said infinite density or infinite energy is a concept that appears to be in contradiction with the evidence of physics. But that doesn't apply. All infinities are possible. In fact, space could be infinitely large. There's no presumption that space isn't infinitely large. It could be. What we now know about physics suggests it probably isn't, but there's no law of physics that says space can't be infinitely large. So this notion that you deduce that infinity is impossible because you don't like it, it's just not the way the world works. Because infinities happen all the time, whether you like them or not. Not only that, it doesn't lead to irrational actions. Mathematicians have a way of dealing with infinity. We can add infinities. We can take numbers and an infinite series that, for example, the series 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 to infinity actually has, in mathematical terms, can have a finite sum, minus 112. Okay? It may not seem logical to you. It may seem inconceivable to you that the sum of a series of positive terms, each of which is bigger than 112, could end up being minus 112. But the fact that it's inconceivable to you just means you're ignorant. Okay. Now, this idea that Occam's razor suggests, I mean, first of all, Occam's razor is not a principle of science. Okay, it's a nice idea that you should try for the simplest answer to any question. And physicists try and use that. Sometimes the simplest answer doesn't work. In genomics, for example, it'd be nice if every gene, in fact, you talked about more than one cause for an effect. It'd be nice if every gene, every disease was caused by a single gene. One of the reasons that genomics is so difficult is we've discovered there's a complex interaction of genes, so that in fact, that there are many separate causes of most diseases. There are very few diseases that have a single cause. But in fact, you know what is simpler than the number 1? The number 0. 0 is a much simpler reason. There's no cause. Okay, so if you really wanted to apply Occam's razor, in fact, you'd apply no cause. Now, you also use the term causality, which is a term I understand. You didn't define it. Do you want to define it?
I mean,
well, why don't you do it now?
I don't want to do that thing.
Well, I thought we were going to have a chat.
Yeah, but I want to have a chat, not a chat. So it's less rhetoric, more connection.
No, let's have a chat. No, I think we talked about rhetoric. We were talking about the lecture you just gave. I want to have a chat. I'm asking you a question. You know what causality means. You use the term.
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
I mean, if you use a term, you should know what it means.
Yes. I have my
you
definition. I have my definition.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll define, and that's, cause precedes effect. Does that sound good?
No, that's the wrong definition.
Okay. Well, I'd like to learn what it is.
Well, for example, there's an interesting book about the quantum physics and causality, and the philosophers and philosophers of science and scientists have disagreed on a specific definition. So they've reduced back to a fundamental definition. Do you want to have a chat or a chat?
You quoted a book on physics.
Yeah, I haven't finished yet.
Physicists don't disagree about the definition of causality.
Have you presumed your results here? Do you really want to connect with me as a human being?
No.
But you've asked me a question, you're answering it for me? I mean, come on.
You quoted physicists. Come on.
I said scientists. Okay. Now, which is the same, I agree. Now, so from my limited knowledge, and I do believe it is limited, of course, is that the agreement has been on something which produces an effect, which includes, therefore, you can have something called asymmetric spontaneous causality, where the cause exists prior causally, but not prior temporally. So there is a whole range.
What's prior causally, not prior temporally?
Prior causally means that there is I'll give you an example. The Kantian example was you have an infinite ball that's on an infinite pillow. Now, they both, time doesn't exist here, but you're not going to say that indentation is not as a result of the ball. So there is a causal dependency there, and time is out of the window. So we could discuss causality until the cows come home, but it's not as simple as what you're trying to say in terms of that. It doesn't presume temporality. You see?
Well, I think it does. I think again, you think carefully what you just did. Okay. The ball doesn't create an indent in the pillow. By the way, you used infinite. I thought we weren't allowed infinite. But anyway, It was an example. Yeah, well, it's an example of a physical example, which you said doesn't exist. But it doesn't matter what's infinite. A pillow here, a finite pillow and a finite ball.
Yes.
Okay. There's an indent.
Of course there is.
Okay. Was the ball there or not?
Well, my example wasn't based on finitude, it's based on the book.
Well, but if the ball isn't on the pillow, it doesn't create an indent. Right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So it had to be. So was it put on the pillow or not?
That's irrelevant. You're damning the example.
then
That's
taking
a logical fallacy.
No,
Get the
no,
point
no.
I'm
The
trying
point
to
is
say.
that the physical causes have physical effects. So either the ball is on the pillow or not. Now, the point about causality is that the interesting aspect of it is it's an interesting physical question. But what if there's no before? Let's take, you talked about the cosmology. So let's take general relativity, whose equations I'm sure you don't know. And
I said I don't know
back to
anything.
the beginning. You made it very clear that the beginning of the universe is very important. You deduced it, but in fact, deduction doesn't matter. The point is, our visible universe did have a beginning because we can measure it. Whether we liked it or not, or whether we think it's sensible or not, it actually did have a beginning, a factor not in dispute. Our universe had a beginning. Now, however, the laws of physics tell us right now, if we extrapolate back to the beginning, that if we took it at face value, that time didn't exist before t equals 0. So if time doesn't exist at all, the sense of cause doesn't even make sense. And this is the key point. In science, we have to realize that our common sense notions sometimes go out the window. When we observe effects, they have causes. But at the beginning of time, when time itself may have come into existence, then that question becomes a bad question. Philosophers can debate it, people can write it down, but it doesn't matter. Now, the other thing I will say is you've somehow talked to me about the fact that the Quran as a literary document is different than other literary documents. And you've given some arguments and I understand. What I actually did this the other day because I've seen you give this talk a gazillion times. I actually input in a computer a lot of Arabic words and asked them to produce it at random. And I produced 2 sentences from the Arabic from the Quran in 11.6 seconds. My computer speaks neither Arabic nor is Arab, but produced those incredibly divine words. Now, the other question, of course, I would have is, and this is a common sense question, is why did God choose Arabic or Aramaic or Greek? I mean, doesn't he speak English? But the Americans always think he does, which is why they invented the Mormon religion. So the question I want to ask is, what makes sense is to ask not the details of the Quran, which I don't want to dwell on, because it's just one of 1,000 different religions, all of which make the same claims, and all of which, if you look at them a priori, are equally ridiculous from a priori common sense notion. For example, and I got this from my late friend Christopher Hitchens, is it sensible to assume that humans evolved in their present form somewhere between 250,000 to 1 million years ago? So you have a God who creates a universe and has 4.5 billion years of life evolving, and then Homo sapiens evolve and live in incredibly awful conditions and for 250,000 years, and suddenly, in the middle of the desert, in a cave where no one can see it, he takes some poor schmo and says, I'm going to tell you the truth. And not only that, I'm going to allow you to save humanity. And in fact, if people don't believe you, they're going to go to hell for eternity. And we can talk in great length, in great sadomasochistic length about the torture they're going to have, and we can all enjoy it. Now, what about all those poor 250,000 years of people, of real people who were struggling to exist and survive, those poor people who were existing before that God decided to give his revelation to Muhammad? Why that? Why would a sensible God wait that long? And of course, the interesting question you have to ask is, why are the revelations always done when no one can see them? If you're asking a court of law, you'd say, well, you know what? Why don't once call down from the sky so everyone? Why is it always given to people in private who then claim they've had a revelation? Now, why should I believe Muhammad's revelations any more than anyone else? In fact, there's a young woman in the United States, in my country, who, as you know, had a revelation. You may know this. She had a revelation. God told her to drown her 4 children in a bathtub. She did. Because God told her. She heard it. She heard it. She had a revelation. It was real. She heard words of incredible harmony and beauty that she'd never experienced before in her life, and she drowned her 4 children. Okay, now she's in a mental hospital for good reason. Because there's no evidence, there's no that a sensible person would believe suggests that God was telling her to drown. Now, why would, let me ask you, do you think Sharia law should be instituted?
Oh, it depends how you define Sharia law. Do you know anything about Sharia law?
Well, I was going to ask you about it.
I will teach you in the next round.
Okay, good. Do you think, for example, that blasphemers should be punished?
Blasphemers meaning?
Maybe if I say, let's just say, forgive me, let's just say I say that someone who married a 9-year-old girl is a pedophile.
Yeah.
And maybe that person is a prophet. Is that a blasphemer? Is that worth being punished?
Well, I think you should be educated first.
No, maybe I'm not saying it happened. But let's say I said that, I made that claim. Should I be punished?
In a court of law with justice, there will be a form of punishment.
Okay. So what about if I openly question the existence of God? In fact, said openly and preached in a room that there's no God. Is that worth punishment?
This is foot in our history. We don't have a problem with intellectual debate and dialogue. Okay. I even mentioned the 8th century Dahriya.
So if I say that Allah is not God, but Thor is God, and people should worship Thor, and I go and that's not blasphemous.
Well, it's wrong and it's childish, but I will have a discussion.
But it's blasphemous to suggest. Is it blasphemous to suggest that Muhammad isn't a prophet?
Well, from an Islamic perspective, but you have to understand the difference between public intellectual discourse and
great,
being deliberately rude.
Okay, well that's.
But we're all for intellectual discourse as per this big debate.
Oh, but you say I should be punished if I suggest Muhammad was a child molester.
No. I wasn't saying that.
Did you say that?
What I'm saying is, in an Islamic law, for instance, if you were to speak about something like this, and you would be taken to a court under certain conditions,
then I would be punished.
There may be a punishment, but generally speaking, it will be more edifying and educational.
But should there be punishment? That's what I'm asking you. Should there?
Oh, you're asking me if there should be punishment? I think we should follow God's law.
So there should be a punishment.
I think there should be a punishment for deliberately harming anyone else.
For openly questioning.
Well, John Stuart Mill had the same opinion.
Openly ridiculing.
No, there's a difference. Don't straw man my position.
Let me take a more clear example.
You're straw manning my
Say
position.
you're a homosexual man, and you have sex with another homosexual man. Should that be subject to punishment?
In the private home, it's outside of the Sharia law. If they did it in public, which doesn't even happen where you're from, then there's a different story.
What would the Where am I from? Where am I from?
Well, you are from the United States of America.
And so it doesn't even happen where I'm from. Now that's true. But in any case,
how's that rude? I thought you're an empiricist.
It does happen where I'm
All
from.
the stats.
So 2 people in Arizona are out in the desert having sex because they really get turned on.
Yes.
And they're both men and they have sex together.
Yes.
Okay. Is that punishment?
If there's no one in the desert, no, it's not.
Okay, let me ask you another question. Is homosexuality wrong?
In the Islamic tradition, it's a sin.
Okay, now here's an idea of why common sense should tell you that Islam, like many other religions, is not common sense. Because first, homosexuality is perfectly natural. In all animal species, almost it's natural. It occurs with a 10% frequency. Okay? In fact, there are good evolutionary reasons for homosexuality. So in that sense, there's no reason and a fundamental. Why would a God who thought it was a sin make it natural among all species? I don't think the sheep, by the way, which 10% of sheep are long-term homosexual relationships. Okay? Why would a God who thought it was a sin create sheep who don't have a soul, who aren't able to think about it, be homosexual? That's the kind of nonsense that we have to ask. And the only way we can determine if it's nonsense is by looking at the world around us, not by deducing it, not by listening to the words of ignorant individuals and Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. Wisdom and learning comes from observing the world around us. And we shouldn't take our wisdom from people who didn't even understand the way the world works. Thank you.
Kraus, thank you very much for your presentation on the atheist worldview.
It's not a worldview,
I think
repeat it.
I think it was actually more like a dialogue, like that. You guys actually.
Yes.
I was wondering when I should jump in and stop you guys. You know. Anyway, I'm sure Aristotle will think the same thing. But now we've got something to sort of come back on. Professor, a lot of people, and no doubt Hamza, about 10 minutes.
Yes.
Possibly come back and answer some of those intentions brought up by Professor Kraus.
Thank you very much, Professor Kraus. Audience, first and foremost, I think most of what he said was a red herring. A red herring is a very smelly fish put across the path of running boats. And the reason it was a red herring because he said I spoke about science. I specifically said he knows better than I do. I specifically didn't use it as my key argument for the finite of the universe, and he would correct me on something that I didn't even mention myself. This is what he called not rhetoric, not intellectual argument, what he called sophistry. It's rhetoric with crap, frankly. Now, that would be better. But again, it's a small matter. When it comes to things like hell, we really got it with just one okay? No one disagrees with the concept of punishment, okay? You don't dispute with the concept of punishment. So when it comes to people who haven't heard about Islam, there's a whole array of words that matter. Just as I expected your lifetime and my lifetime, you'll understand any absolute condemnation of that fact. If they love each other and care for each other, and they go off and it doesn't affect anything else. Okay, would I recommend it? No. Would I be happy about that? Would I be willing to listen to those arguments? If they were rational, maybe. Okay, good. So this is precisely the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Kraus, is that I find it quite interesting. Someone who adopts an atheist position would have strong moral judgments about a religious position, whereas your moral judgments, at best, are relative and subjective. Now, when you look about moral theory, from an Islamic perspective and a religious perspective, you see that objective morals, like even pointing the finger and saying, no, you're wrong, you're nonsense, Sharia law is backward, these kind of strong emotive things, I think we can only be that emotive and strong in an objective sense if you have God as the grounding for your objective moral value. Because if you take God out of the picture, he's the only concept that transcends human subjectivity. Social pressure, you know, that doesn't work. Look what happened in Nazi Germany. You know, for example, evolution makes it end up being ephemeral and empty. If you look at the philosopher of science, Michael Root, he said, you think loving thy neighbor as thyself is like you're going above and beyond yourself. But essentially, it has no true meaning. It's just a product of survival and reproduction. So from this perspective, you don't have an ontological grounding for objective moral truth. The best you could do, what a lot of atheists have done, is, well, we believe in moral realism, which is moral truths are just moral truths because they are. Well, Islam just is, and the Prophet Muhammad just is, and the Quran just is. That's not an argument. So the reason I asked you that question, sir, was to say, how on earth, from an intellectual perspective, can we point the finger at religion from a moral perspective, and especially today's the irony
20 years after he died, so no space, no time, no laws, no nothing.
But that's still a quantum haze.
No,
That is.
No, there's no quantum. There's no universe. There's no universe. Nothing. Zero, zip, nada.
So why did you say in your own book then that we would reduce to our own quantum haze?
Hamza,
Well, he took a lot of my time.
Well, I want my time.
Delving into it.
We'll continue the discussion.
Oh, we will do. No, of course.
Okay. Thanks very much, Hamza. Please come and sit down, brother.
Woo!
I didn't want to stop you in mid-flow there, but over to Professor.
There must be some Greek in Professor Kraus.
Okay, well, we can continue the discussion because it should be a discussion. My point is that the question, I repeat again, what's more sensible? What's more sensible, ultimately, what produces more rational action? And I'm sorry, you talk about tolerance. I get so tired of hearing people talk about tolerance, but then I hear people talking about blasphemers. I should be allowed to blaspheme all I want because ridicule is an important part of inquiry and discussion. Sometimes ridiculing something illuminates it. And I hear about blasphemers. I hate to say it, and this may be a complete misapplication of Islam. It could be that Islam, as it's practiced in many countries in the world, the misapplication of Islam. But all I can see is intolerance when I see those principles applied. Intolerance to blasphemers, intolerance to homosexuals, intolerance in general. Now, the other thing I want to say is this God, if we ask what's sensible, why would we think that this unproven God that is supposed to be the basis of not just Islam, but all religions, different gods, different characteristics, but the Islamic God, much like the Judeo-Christian God, is a real creep. This is a God, worse than Saddam Hussein. Instead of torturing you just for your life, tortures you for infinity. Forgive me the word, but eternity. Let me use that word. Eternity. We're not believing. We're not believing. You're tortured for infinity. The tortures are actually described in the Quran, and you know it as well as I do. And the point is, if you just ask yourself common sense, if you were finding, say you had an ant colony you made in your house, would you be offended if those ants geometry 5? Well, let's start with 50 times a day before Muhammad cut down to 30 and then 5. Would you be offended if those ants did geometry 5 times a day? And if they didn't look up to you or didn't recognize your existence, would you destroy them? No, I mean, it just seems so petty. So why should we believe in an hateful, unmerciful, petty, sadomasochistic, homophobic, sexist God? It's just irrational, not sensible. There's nothing. And the point is, and I don't want to single out Islam, and I know I'm offending, but the same is true for the God of Moses. Okay, if you really believe that the scriptures were literally true, the morals in that book are reprehensible. It's okay when angels appear to do a lot of things, including coming down and making revelations to Muhammad, which Muhammad didn't write down. As far as I know, the first example of the Quran was 20 years after he died, so there's a lot of talk. And some of that talk got turned into perfect writing well after Muhammad was dead. But those angels come down. But in this case, of course, Lot, as you know, the angels came down, and they were men. They came in the form of men, which I don't think allowed. But anyway, they did. And then they were going to be raped. So what Lot do? Of course, he said, don't rape them. Take my daughter. His daughters are expensive. What kind of moral lesson is that you want to learn? Okay. Now, I'm sorry, that's in the Bible. Actually, that's from my religion. Okay, or my ancestors. I have none. Okay. So those are the kind of moral lessons that I find not sensible. And so I'm happy I picked the Old Testament, not the Quran, to talk about immoral intolerance. The idea of punishing people for eternity or choosing to find something unlikely is not tolerant. The idea of punishing them in vicious, evil, ugly ways for all eternity is not merciful. It is the opposite of rational common sense. Now, in terms of explanatory things, let me just spend a few minutes teaching a little bit of science. So, if you have an infinite temporal, let's say time exists beyond our universe. Let's just allow for that. And let's say our universe, a universe can, given the laws of nature, spontaneously come into existence. Okay? Then it will come into existence. It will come into existence at some time. And the fact that it came into existence at that time need not have any reason.
我将热闹，那巴黎将热闹，我是将要将热闹。